welcome to everyone who's joined us online, and welcome Siera. Siera Hyte is a Schiller family curator of Indigenous American art. And she presented this talk, our 3 and 30, on Tuesday with Jeffrey Allison, who's unable to join us this morning. But this is a program that we always do twice a month, once in person, and then again virtually. So we're excited about having you here, Siera, really for our first public program. So we're very excited to have you, and I'm excited that you will be doing this program, which is Indigenous Art Histories, Indigenous Resistance.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. I'm really looking forward to speaking with everybody today about Indigenous art histories and Indigenous resistance through the lens of a few works on view in our galleries. We did have a really great conversation at the museum during our in-person version of this program. So I'm hoping to leave some time today after I present briefly on the works that are on view in our gallery, so that hopefully we can talk about them a little bit together. But please also feel free to pop a question into the chat or an observation if something comes to you about these works. So I'm going to be discussing 3 different works that are installed together in our American galleries, which is what we did during our in-person conversation. However, with the benefit of being virtual today, I also wanted to kick us off by discussing this work by the artist Raven Costello, which is also on view at the museum right now. So I would definitely encourage you to come in if you can, and if you're close by, to take a look in person at everything that we're going to be talking about today. But this work by Raven Costello called Puddawis is on view in our Evans Court Gallery, so in a different physical location than the other installation that we're going to be talking about today. So I wanted to bring up this work for a few different reasons. One being that I want to highlight for our virtual audience that we are joining you today I'm joining you today from the traditional territories of the Powhatan Chiefdom and the Monacan Nation, and from the state of Virginia, whose geographies intersect with several federally recognized tribes, including Chickahominy, Eastern Division, Nansemond, Pamunkey, Rappahannock, and Upper Mattaponi, in addition to the Monacan Nation that I mentioned, as well as several state-recognized tribes. And I bring this up to pay respect to these communities whose ancestors and present-day members have cared for the lands and waters that sustain us since time immemorial and continue to do so. And also because when we talk about Indigenous resistance, which is a part of the title of this program, one thing that I've been reflecting on in the conversation earlier this week and prior to joining you all today is how important it is when we talk about resistance to actually name what it is that we are resisting and have been resisting. So Virginia, as a place of very early colonial contact, where settlers have been for centuries before the advent of the United States, and where settlers have been attempting the genocide of Indigenous communities here and enacting various forms of cultural suppression for centuries, including ancestral artistic and creative traditions, is something that has been resisted here in Virginia, where I'm joining you all from, for centuries. And that really brings me to this beautiful work by Raven, because I think it's an incredible example of the ways in which contemporary Indigenous artists continue to resist colonial suppression and cultural genocide, and also the ways in which Indigenous artists are really revitalizing and leading a resurgence of cultural practices. So this is a feather mantle that the museum commissioned specifically for our collection. And feather mantles are something that were worn by Indigenous peoples from various Eastern Woodlands communities. So not just specific to Mattapanai people or Rappahannock people. Raven Costello is also of Rappahannock descent, but a garment that was worn by folks from across Eastern Woodlands communities. Um, and I came across a great interview with Raven where she talked about how when she first became interested in making a feather mantle, um, that she had seen contemporary Indigenous artists from other Southeastern tribes who were making these garments. And she had also seen historical and ancestral examples of feather mantles, but that she didn't know exactly how to construct a mantle. She didn't have the knowledge of the exact technique that her people used, but that she was able to research and create her own way of doing it. And that for her, that's really an example of who we are as Indigenous people. She said that things evolve over time and we learn new ways of doing things that also connect back to ancestral ways of doing and knowing. It's also just a particularly beautiful work when you see it in person. So we're going to move on now to our American galleries, and these are just a few installation views of the works that we're going to be chatting about for the rest of our time together. This installation was actually put on view prior to my arrival at the VMFA. I've only been here for a couple of months. So this was put together by Johanna Minnick, who is our former curator of Indigenous American art, and our curator of American art, Leo Mazow. And you can hopefully see from these images that this is a trans-historical and transcultural installation. So it includes both historic and contemporary artworks by both American and Indigenous artists. And maybe a little bit unexpectedly today, I actually want to kick us off by talking about a work in the installation that is made not by an Indigenous artist. But the reason that I want to do that is not so much to talk about Walter Ufer, who is the person who painted this work, but to talk about the sitter who's included in this painting and the community that he was a part of and the time and the socio-political context in which this painting was made. And again, connect that back to this idea of Indigenous resistance, ongoing Indigenous resistance, and Indigenous struggle and Indigenous art history. So the sitter who's pictured in this work is a man named Jim Mirabel, and he was a sitter for Walter Ufer throughout Ufer's time in New Mexico. Ufer was a part of an artist colony called the Tau Society of Artists, which was a group of primarily Anglo-American as well as a few European painters who relocated primarily from the northeastern part of the United States down to New Mexico at the turn of the century. They were in part able to do this because of westward expansion and the building of railroads through Pueblo communities and other southwestern Indigenous communities. And Ufer himself, who's a part of this group, and they all started to make paintings of both the southwestern landscape and Pueblo homelands, but also portraits of Pueblo people. And these paintings circulated really widely throughout the United States. You've probably seen a work by a Tau Society of Artists painter before. They're in collections of many different American art institutions. And they're often, not always, but often used to sort of monolithically represent either Indigenous Southwestern United States communities or monolithically just represent Indigenous American communities as a whole. So Ufer was a bit of an outlier in the TSA in that he was an avowed socialist. So he was really interested in painting scenes of labor. So a lot of his portraits that you see are of Taos Pueblo community members, a lot of Jim himself participating in hunting, fishing, farming, something that intersects with labor. But the reason that I wanted to talk about this work is I'm really interested in reading ideas of Indigenous resistance and to how we understand this setting and even Jim's pose himself. So in the conversation on Tuesday in the galleries, we talked a bit, one, about the fact that in this painting, we see Jim showing his back to us, looking out at the landscape rather than uh, holding the gaze of the viewer. I found that interesting to kind of dwell on for a moment because I think with a lot of portraits kind of from this time period of Indigenous people made by non-native painters, we often see sitters um, who are face forward and almost feel a sense of potentially like being forced to hold our gaze, right? So here we have a sitter who has his back turned away from us and is really in this moment of internal reflection. And I also want to draw our attention to the time in which this work was made. So the Tau Society of Artists um, was active from around 1917 until around the early 30s. Just about a decade before they arrived in Pueblo homelands, the federal government had seized over 40,000 acres of land from Taos Pueblo that they repurposed as a state park. And when they did this, the land that they took from Taos Pueblo included a sacred site to the community called Blue Lake. I don't know if any folks who are with us today are familiar with the case of Blue Lake, but I would definitely encourage y'all, if you're interested, once we're done with this program, to go read a little bit more about this particular instance of land theft. And also, this is a really powerful instance of eventually land being returned legally to a community. So when Blue Lake and the rest of the land was seized from Taos Pueblo, this cut off the community's access to a really important spiritual site, as well as interfered with their ability to hunt and fish for themselves and sustain themselves in the way that their community has been doing since time immemorial. So this is obviously a huge, huge disruption of traditional Indigenous lifeways. Like I mentioned, when we looked at the work by Raven, when we talk about Indigenous resistance, we're really talking about ongoing political and cultural struggle against various forms of cultural suppression, right? And that continues today, and we see that in fights for tribal sovereignty, respect for cultural ceremonial traditions, cultural patrimony, land rights, etc., as part of the fight for Indigenous liberation. So everyone who would have been featured in a Taos Society of Artists portrait from Taos Pueblo would have been incredibly affected by this fight for Blue Lake and fight for land. It actually took several decades of Taos Pueblo fighting the federal government's seizure of their territories in the court before this land was legally returned into their care. So just in my opinion, a powerful example of resistance. And I think it's interesting in this case that we see Jim Mirabal pictured next to water. There are some reports and accounts that some of the sitters who worked closely with TSA painters, in some cases directed where portraits were made. Um, so, oh, sorry, I was just looking at a comment in the chat. So I like to, in reading resistance into this portrait, also think about it being an intentional and political act that Jim Mirabal is here placing himself against the water and within his traditional territories to kind of draw attention to a kind of key political issue and political struggle that was happening in his community at the time. I also think it's interesting just to talk a little bit more about the artwork itself that we see Ufer has chosen colors for the sitter's clothes that somewhat connect him to the landscape, although he is also very stark against the landscape. But I think one thing we see with a lot of the TSA portraits is connecting visually the sitters involved to the environment around them. Any questions before I move on? I see someone in the chat mention that they found information on feather mantles. Thank you for sharing that with us. So now we're going to move on to another work featured in this gallery by the Cochiti Pueblo contemporary artist, Virgil Ortiz. Virgil is one of my favorite contemporary artists. For folks who aren't familiar with his work, again, I would definitely recommend going and looking him up after this talk. He's just a really creative, expansive contemporary artist who works across sculpture, fashion design, photography, AR, VR, incredibly multidisciplinary. And one thing that I've heard Virgil talk about many times is that as an artist, he believes that one of his life's missions or his life's work as an artist is to raise awareness of the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, the real life Pueblo Revolt, or as I've heard it called by several Pueblo scholars and historians and artists, the first American Revolution, which I love, although, somewhat tongue in cheek. So all of Virgil's work includes kind of this sort of larger cinematic universe that he's created of a version of the Pueblo Revolt that takes place in 1680, present day, and 2180. So it's very sci-fi, very much within the realm of Indigenous futurism, kind of taking place on three multiple timelines. And within his narrative of the Pueblo Revolt, there are characters or figures who are able to time travel back and forth between these multiple time periods and who help Pueblo people in the battle against colonial incursion and act as knowledge keepers and help to perpetuate and uphold traditional ways of art making, traditional ceremony, stories and songs, etc. So Stu and Kutta are aeronauts within Virgil's world. I was watching a few different interviews with him and just kind of being reminded of, again, what a sort of expansive and open kind of world he's created for us within the Pueblo Revolt, which I should say for folks who don't know. So the real life Pueblo Revolt was a revolt by all of the Pueblo tribes against Spanish colonial invasion in 1680, where all of the Pueblo tribes at that time came together to push out invading Spanish colonial forces from their homeland. So Virgil talks about that being a narrative for him that connects to present day Indigenous resistance, that feeds into the very reason why Pueblo communities continue to not just exist, but thrive and uphold traditional and ancestral ways of being. So Stu and Kutta are aeronauts who are actually aliens who landed on Earth before the Pueblo Revolt to help support Pueblo people, and they kind of morph themselves to look more human. I read one statement from Virgil where he talks about Stu and Kutta as twins, having this like really deep innate connection that makes them incredible fighters. And he describes a scene where Stu and Kutta are kind of flying their battleship over a scene of battle and collecting ancestral Pueblo pottery and other ancestral items that have been unearthed so that they can save them for future generations. These works in person are about 2 feet tall, so they're not huge. They also connect to another art historical instance of what I like to think of as Indigenous resistance. So with these works, And with a lot of his figurative clay works, Virgil is referencing a more historical version of Cochiti Pueblo pottery called Manos. Something else I would encourage y'all to look up after this program. So these were a form of figurative ceramic works that were made by Cochiti Pueblo potters beginning in the 19th century. So as settlers and outsiders made their way into Cochiti Pueblo and other Pueblo territories, Cochiti Pueblo potters started making these kind of satirical um, figures that were social commentary that featured different non-native people who were not members of the community. So you see sheriffs, Catholic priests, circus performers, and the way Virgil talks about it is that once non-native viewers realized that the potters were making these works as a form of social commentary and of satire, this art form was suppressed. And in its place, it was supplanted by another figure that Cochiti Pueblo potters are known for, called the storyteller. And Virgil, as a young artist, was making these figures who were seen as they were sort of weird. They were not in the form of the storyteller. They featured different elements of, again, social commentary, and a collector of Pueblo pottery that he and his family knew. When he saw Virgil as a young person making these works, brought him to his collection and showed him some Cochiti Pueblo manos from the 19th century. And Virgil talks about how when he and his family saw these works, his parents told him, like, the ancestors are speaking through you. And he really felt this connection to a previous generation of artists from his community. So I love how many different layers there are to these works, ranging across like multiple centuries and multiple kind of lineages of Pueblo political and artistic resistance. And this is just an image of Virgil with some characters from another kind of version of his Pueblo Revolt 1680-2180 series. And finally, before we leave time for discussion, I wanted to also talk about this painting that's on view by Kay Walking Stick, who's a Cherokee Nation artist. So this work is called Four Directions Stillness, and you can see here a little bit that this work is a diptych, so it's actually two canvases paired together. Kay talks about how when she started making these series of diptychs that paired together more abstracted canvases with more, we'll say, traditional looking landscape canvases, that she was making paintings that featured abstract symbols that had been cut into or kind of incised into the canvas, which we can see here with the green plus symbol. And that she started making what I heard her call in various interviews and conversations, memory paintings. So Kay talks a lot about really like being in awe and feeling a lot of profound gratitude for the natural beauty of the environment that can be found across the US. And so she would go to these different landscapes as a part of her travels that inspired her, and she'll make sketches, notes, provisional drawings to help her commit place to memory. But then when she gets back to her studio to make a painting, she would paint these landscapes from memory and literally with her hands. So in the galleries, one visitor pointed this out on Tuesday, and I loved this. They observed that the top of the rock face that we see here, that the marks used to render the rocks are basically the same size as a set of hands. So they're really indexed to her body. There's a real surface and texture to both canvases. I think it's a little bit easier to see in the work on the canvas on the left here with the plus sign, that sense of texture. But that gestural quality is also really apparent in the work on the right. So with this work, I love thinking about how Kay is kind of leading us to a more complex understanding of landscape itself through this very like embodied sensation of, in this case, Bandelier National Park in New Mexico. And I also found it really striking in watching an interview with Kay about this particular work, that on the left, this symbol here, the green symbol, is a symbol to represent the four cardinal directions, which are sacred to some Indigenous communities, that she included as a reference to that and also as a symbol of prayer. But as an artist, and I found this really challenging in a way, and appreciated her bringing this forward. She talked about also that in addition to this being a symbol of the four directions, that she's aware that viewers could read this as a symbol of the Christian cross, that she also thinks it looks like a plus sign. And she says that as a plus sign, you know, for her, this leads her to think of this idea of there's so much more, to the earth, to the landscape, and really complicating our notion of what pairing these two works together could mean. This work on the left is made with saponified wax, which is beeswax emulsified with water, mixed with paint to really create this like bumpy, rocky texture. And one final thing I'll share about this work is that Kay talks about how when she first started making this series that included diptychs, she had the work on the left already with the abstract symbol. And when she paired it with a landscape work, she says that when she saw the two of them together, that they were talking to one another and that she really felt that they were in a symbiotic relationship. And so I think we see that here. It was really interesting to hear from visitors on Tuesday how some folks were reading these two canvases as potentially being in tension with one another, or potentially presenting two disparate ideas about landscape or environment. And then other folks were reading them as very much interlocked and as one work. So for me, I don't think there's, you know, a right answer. There's not a yes or no for how we read these. But I do think there's a profound sense of, just as like we see in the title of stillness and of prayer, that I think again leads me to the words of the artist, where I've seen her talk about just how precious the environment is and how very threatened it is in the face of environmental degradation and climate change.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank
Okay.
you so much. Bye.
Bye.